I was asked to talk about growing grapes for sparkling wine, and to begin, I have a very tightly prepared program that will take about 54 minutes. But what I need to know is how many of you have actually ever grown grapes specifically for sparkling wine? Just hold up your hands. Oh, okay, more than the 2 that somebody suggested. Cool. And how many of you are here just because this is a parallel 45 thing, and the idea of growing grapes for sparkling wine is to a large extent what's done in the vineyard to optimize the quality of grapes for sparkling wine is very much unlike what you're doing for table wines. And let me tell you a couple of the reasons for that. And let me recognize that where the biggest difference between sparkling wine and table wine occurs is if the sparkling wine you're making is traditional champagne method, bottle fermented sparkling wine that's aged with the secondary yeast fermentation lees in the bottle for an extended period of time. That is where the biggest difference in the way you treat things in the winery and the way and the characteristic of the grapes that you want to arrive at the winery at harvest time. If the sparkling wine you're making is a younger, not as aged, or not as dependent upon the character of yeast autolysis, the differences diminish. And if you're making a sparkling wine that is very young, very fresh, and very fruit driven, a lot of the differences that I'm going to talk about virtually disappear. And you can make those kind of sparkling wines quite successfully from grapes that weren't grown with that in mind. Having said that, I don't advise anybody to do it that way, but you can. The big thing to recognize is that what you're trying to achieve in the vineyard for sparkling wine is physiological and phenological maturity of the grape with as low a sugar as you can have and as low a pH and as high an acid. But like all generalizations, that one ain't worth a damn because there's exceptions to almost all of those things. Generally, you really want low pH, high acid, and low sugar. But you don't want to achieve those things at the expense of flavor and aroma. And so you really need grapes that are, the Champenois have a term that translates to industrial maturity, which doesn't sound very fancy, but that's basically what they're saying, is industrial maturity for champagne grapes is flavor of a ripe grape, aroma of a ripe grape. Neither of those should be overripe, neither of them should be green or underripe. There's that range of flavor and aroma that you want to hit, and you don't want too much sugar. And so typically crop levels are fairly high for sparkling wine because under most conditions of growing in northern latitudes, heavier crop load can result in physiological maturity with lower sugars. It's possible to overcrop and not get physiological maturity. That's not a good thing. It's possible to undercrop and achieve physiological maturity earlier in the growing season than you might find optimal. That's okay from a wine perspective, but economically you've given up some potential crop that you could have had otherwise. And so one of the questions that somebody was asking was, how do you decide what crop level to have in any particular vineyard, any particular year? And the answer is, I have no idea. Absolutely none. I can tell you that it varies so much from cultivar to cultivar. Some varieties respond better to heavier crops. Chardonnay is a good example of a variety that really does well if you crop the bejesus out of it. It does nicely. Pinot Noir also. There's a reason that those are two of the chief varieties grown in Champagne, because they respond well to heavy crop and develop nice flavors at low sugars. Sauvignon Blanc is not a variety that I've ever heard of anybody seriously trying to make sparkling wine out of, and I have a feeling that it's partly because it really has the difference between underripeness and ripeness is a fairly sharp line, like there is for Cabernet Franc. I mean, Cabernet Franc can be really green and nasty, and then it'll hit a point where it's okay. The line for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir is a little bit broader. In terms of, I looked up some statistics this morning. I thought I'd have a couple facts to throw in this. In Champagne, now admittedly the regulations in Champagne that regulate how heavy a crop they can have, they would insist are quality related, but we all know that they're controlling the market because their standard is 10,400 kilograms per hectare, with the provision that it can be adjusted up or down seasonally and never go over 15,400 kilograms per hectare. Now 15,400 kilograms per hectare is just under 7 tons to the acre. Yeah. Okay. The 10,400 is 4 3/4 tons per acre. So that's where they kind of set their goal. But I've visited Champagne post-harvest, and in a good growing year, they will leave grapes unharvested because they will have grown more than they are legally allowed to pick, and they just stop picking when they get to that point, and just leave unharvested rows. I didn't see this, but I had reported to me by reliable folks that Roederer has a block that they've gotten 30,000 kilograms per hectare, and they make nice wine from that. Now that's like not quite 15 tons, 14 something tons per acre. Now they're not allowed to harvest all of that, but what they do harvest, they do make nice wine from. That's an exception. That's not the rule, and I'm not saying that it would be a good idea to try to go to 7 or 8 or 9 tons under our conditions. Two things really limit us here that are unlike Champagne. The number one thing that you first of all think about is our winters. We have harsher winters than they do. And so we do need to have some carbohydrate reserves in the wood. We can't crop the vines to the point where everything that they're doing is ripening the grapes. We pick them the next day, the leaves fall off, and it's winter. They're not going to do well under those conditions. Those of you who do Riesling ice wine kind of things know that you can't realistically do the same block year after year after year because you're going to hurt the vines. So our winters are an issue. But the other thing that is significant about the way the vine grows during the growing season is Champagne is far north of us. They're at the 49th parallel. That means that, assuming that means their day length is a lot longer during the growing season, a lot longer. June 22nd, they have 35 minutes more potential sunlight that day than we do. That's the longest day of the year. But even at the spring and fall equinoxes, March 22nd, September 22nd, they're still 15 minutes longer days than we are. Now that falls off rapidly, so that by the time you get into late October, they're much shorter than we are, and in the winter much shorter, but the vines don't care at that point. So Cultivars that respond well to sunlight, day length, and don't need a lot of heat do really well under those conditions further north you go on the planet. That's one of the reasons Riesling is so good in those areas, and why we're kind of on the southern edge of Riesling wonder spot, because we don't have quite as long a days as you might like for Riesling to respond well to. It's not to say that we can't grow great Riesling. We do, and we can use it for sparkling. That's wonderful. I do think that the big thing to think about is this, and I'll repeat it again, and I'll probably say it 2 or 3 more times before we're done. We're trying to achieve physiological maturity with low sugar. California has areas that they really, really struggle with that. They just cannot get grapes to be physiologically mature without too high sugars. When the sparkling wine industry really ramped up in Northern California in the 70s and 80s with the infusion of interest from the Champenois, the first couple of years they we're supposed to pick them at 18 bricks. So pick them at 18 bricks. It's the middle of July, but they're 18 bricks, pick them. Well, the wines tasted like crap because the grapes were nowhere close to mature. They did work out viticultural things to deal with that. That's not the problem that we have. We don't have the problem of them getting too ripe too soon. So to achieve the kind of levels that you want to have enough crop to slow the vine down so that it's not building sugar. It's just developing the flavor and aromatic compounds, which it will do naturally, because we all know the grapevine is not growing grapes for us. It's getting seeds ripe and trying to make birds and stuff want to take those seeds and spread them somewhere so that they can reproduce themselves. Well, we don't care, for sparkling wine, we don't care a whit about the skins. It's not like red table wines where you're extracting not only color but other flavor and aroma compounds from skins. We're going to try to carefully press the grapes so we get none of that. We want the juice from the center of the central zone of the berry, and just what we have to get from around the seeds and under the skin. But we don't want any. The further into the center you get and the further out to the edge you get, the worse it is for sparkling wine. For classic bottled fermented sparkling wine that's aged for a long period of time. If you're making very fruit-driven, short-aged things, you can certainly use those, particularly the ones under the skin where there's some more varietal aroma and flavor. You still probably don't want to get too much around the seeds, because that's just usually tannins that I mean, you can strip them out, but the idea is not to take things away. Don't have them there in the first place. I do think that if you're going to try to grow grapes under our conditions for sparkling wine, you need to make that decision. Ideally, you make that decision a year before you harvest, because you'll make some pruning decisions. You'll make all kinds of decisions that are influenced by that. And the further ahead of time you make those decisions, the better off you are, and you do have the opportunity anytime now that fruit is now that fruit is set, you have the opportunity to take off crop. It's hard to add anymore at this point, but you can take off crop. Ideally, you don't want to have to do that. You want to have judged everything properly and had the crystal ball so you know what's going to happen in August and September. and you're just going to be able to let the vines chug along and do their thing and achieve the fruit character that you want. Remembering, excuse me, sorry. Remembering that you have, as I said, you have the ability to reduce crop, but if you wait too long to reduce crop, you're not really going to do much other than throw grapes on the ground. The vine, by the time you get to veraison, I think it's too late. And it's at that point that altogether too many times people say, geez, veraison is later than I thought it would be, and so maybe I better drop some crop. Well, you maybe save the vine, but you're not going to help the quality of that crop. It's too late for that. So crop as heavy as you possibly can without hurting the vines. Remember, they got to get through the winter. Make your cropping decisions really early. And then, of course, harvesting and pressing the juice is everything. I mean, you can have beautiful grapes that are poorly harvested, poorly transported to the winery, poorly pressed, and you're going to have crap wine. So it's really important that that the vineyard and the winery. I kidded Tony and Megan about how Tony doesn't want to know what Megan's doing, and Megan doesn't want to know. Actually, the reverse is true. You know, they really want to work seamlessly together. And we all know that their perfection is not a possibility in this world. We should strive for it, but we should accept that we're never going to get there. That does not mean we should not try every year to do the very best we possibly can, and expect our vines are trying to do that. They're trying every year. They're trying to ripen those seeds just as well as they possibly can. The fact is, we don't care about that. We care about ancillary things that they're doing, and we need to make sure that we can talk to our vines appropriately in languages they understand. I've ranted long enough, I think, and what I'd like to do is, are there burning questions where you say, you're full of crap, that can't be right? I'm happy to discuss those things because I may be wrong. It's happened before in my life. Yeah.
I was just curious, and if you're starting blank slate now, it's as far as soil conditions, you know, clay and limestone and Champagne in here were on sand, it seems. Plant spacing, clone selection, do any of those things play a bigger part in your decision-making process today than they did when you first started out?
Yeah, well, in my decision-making process, they certainly would, because there are more options now than there were 40 years ago. I mean, there was and I keep referring to Champagne, but that's not the only place in the world where really good sparkling wines are made. So let's not just get too hung up about the soils in Champagne versus the soils here. It's really matching the rootstock and the cultivar clone and the management practices in the vineyard, spacing and so on, to your local situation. I experimented with as dense as I could to begin with, and I think it'd be nice if we had equipment that we could go back to greater density, but I had to go from 2 meters between the rows to 2.2 meters just because I was not a good enough equipment operator to drive a small tractor on the side hill in that space. Over the row tractors make some sense, but they would require a little bit lower trellis. The lower trellis you want closer because you're trying to get all the sunlight you can, and there's a point at which too low is too low for our spring and fall frost conditions. So
do do you have, is that about 20 inches or is that below that for frost protection?
What do you mean?
Well, as far as
The
you're
fruiting,
talking
the
plain-
fruiting zone or the top of the trellis?
Yeah, your wire, fruiting wire.
Oh, I think 20 inches is fine. I've done it down at 8, and that's a little
Low.
low.
As far as making stuff out of like like Wadensville Pinot or Wente Shot or some of the other varietals that you typically find in still wine, do you see any advantages to other clones versus
Sure.
those, or do those make fine sparkling if the phenolics are there?
If we're only talking about the only two varieties I feel comfortable talking about clones are with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Chardonnay, the experience that I've had and the experience that I've gathered from talking to people is the best clones for table wine are the best clones for sparkling wine. I mean, the Champenois love clone 96, which it shows how old I am. 96 was a hot clone 15 years ago. Now there's a whole bunch of newer selections that are probably even more exciting. But the point is that for Chardonnay, it responds well to heavy crop, and there isn't any particular berry size conditions. The bigger the berry, the better for sparkling, because you're going to be able to get more juice from not close to the skin and not close to the seeds. For Pinot Noir, it's a different situation. There are the best clones for sparkling wine really aren't great for table wine because they're large berry, they have great aroma and flavor, but they're going to be really low in color. Because what you're trying to do with sparkling wine is make a white wine out of this thing. So you don't want small berry, heavily colored clones of Pinot Noir for sparkling wine, which is exactly what you probably want for table wine. Doesn't mean you can't make good, flavorful sparkling wine from that. You just have to be aware that color is probably going to be an issue. And you may want to make a rosé. Just because you may not be able to get the color down without stripping it, and that's not cool. Other cultivars I don't have enough experience with, but probably other people here have. I don't know about Riesling. I don't know about, well, I don't know what clones of Pinot Gris we're growing here.
Everything was in the ground when I started.
Yeah, well, the
If you
first
don't know, I don't know.
the first Pinot Gris that I planted came as bud sticks from Amity Vineyards in Oregon in the early 80s when I wanted to get Chardonnay and Pinot Noir clones from Oregon. And they said, oh, you ought to try this variety we think has some promise called Pinot Gris. I'd never heard of it. So they sent me some bud wood and we planted it and it worked good. So we sent bud wood to Grafted Grapevine Nursery in New York and had him graft stuff for us. And I think that's where he got his first Pinot Gris budwood, but I have no idea what clone that is. I don't know how many clones are available in this country.
Charlie would know. Charlie would know.
Somebody.
Charlie Edson.
Yeah.
He brought in a lot of them.
Yep. But I don't think, for white varieties, I don't think clone's going to have a huge impact, except it would be nice to have, for us, it'd be nice to have earlier ripening clones of Riesling. But I have no idea whether there are such things. I don't know what the ripening range is. I do know that the minimum bricks level in Germany is about 14 or 14 and a half bricks to make decent wine. I don't know that we get Riesling here not tasting ugly at 14 at 14 bricks, but as soon as it doesn't taste ugly and tastes neutral, you can make bubbly from it. It may taste pretty neutral at that point, but yeah.
All right, thank you very much. The question I have is the vineyard work, leaf pulling. Any suggestions on changing leaf pulling practices?
You should
we're
really
planning-
talk to Megan, the young lady behind you who does all of the vineyard work here. I don't have any sense about whether there's timing differences or anything like that for table wine versus sparkling wine. And she's growing fruit for both. So
So I've gone to leaf pulling everything, and that is for a disease management purposes. And I think that's the route that everyone is going to need to go if we want to reduce how much we spray. And I don't think spraying alone is going to keep the rats out with the heat units and the rain that we get now. I think leaf pull is the number one tool that you have to reduce rot, and we're doing it on everything.
but you don't do anything different leaf pulling for table wine or sparkling wine in terms of timing or anything like that. It's just
Timing, I do it as early as possible
Yep.
on everything,
Yep.
and it doesn't matter if it's still or sparkling.
Yep.
I start with the Pinots, and I do that to reduce the density of the cluster. This year, with the drought, I could not do leaf pull before bloom. So we lost that opportunity because the drought, the vines were so stunted that I couldn't take that many leaves off at that time. So leaf pull was a little late for me this year, but we're still going to achieve that open canopy. And I like to also do it early because then it has the opportunity to fill in. And when we do want a little bit more shade on that cluster, it will be there at the time we want it. And right now, full sun exposure is just going to make them more hardy, and they're going to grow under the sun their entire development. So later in the season, they won't be shocked with leaf pull happening and then get sun scald. And you just don't want to shock them.
I think that clusters that are grown in the sun versus in the shade, the skins are tougher, which is great for resistance to fungus infections. And for sparkling wine, you don't care how tough the skin really is. What you want to make sure is that the flavor compounds that are in the berry under the skin haven't been adversely affected by rot. And so, fine. It's beautiful. Did I see some?
I had a question back to the pressing thing.
Yep.
With sparkling, are you brown juice club or green juice club? I.e., oxygen exclusion pressing, or let it get exposed to oxygen at the pressing time?
Neither, I would say. Because that's table wine talk.
Okay.
And when I was making table wine, I used to be if it looked like tea coming out of the press, it was great because you had bound up some stuff that you didn't want. For sparkling wine, we don't have the capacity to do it under inert gas, and I don't think it's really necessary. But there are some people that would do that. I think.
Right. I mean, it's kind of tricky to do with whole cluster unless you have something like a Wilms Merlin or one of those.
Well, I mean, you have to have the
presses.
right equipment. Yeah. I don't think it's necessary. The biggest thing for pressing for traditional bottle fermented that's going to be aged in the bottle is very minimal maceration.
So are you whole cluster, or
Yeah.
do you destem?
No, do not destem. Absolutely not. It's got to be whole cluster. And if it's like our tank press, we got a Booker tank press, the 70% of the juice is the cuvee fraction, and that comes out at 1 to maybe 1.1 or 1.2 atmospheres, but you only would have one. You press, you inflate the bladder, press, and you'll do a cycle of bringing it up to 1, deflate it, let the tank turn once, and then go again. Even a second tumble is too much for the best quality juice. You're going to do that when you get to the higher press fractions, later press fractions, but never more than 2 or 3 turns, crumbles, whatever you want to call it. Because that macerating is just horrible. It's bad, bad, bad. Now, you'll put solids in the juice, and some people argue, yeah, but you can take it out. But the point is, don't put stuff in that you have to take out. Whole cluster pressing is essential for that style of sparkling wine. There's no way around it. If you mechanically harvest or hand harvest and crush and destem, you're not going to be able to make that style of sparkling wine. There's just no way in the world you can do it. Because your juice is a muddled mixture. To do it optimally, you will take at least 3, 4, maybe 5 press fractions at different levels of pressure and different amounts of tumbling, and you keep all of them separate, and you ferment them separately. And some of it you may never use in sparkling wine. Some of it you can use the later press fractions that have higher tannins, higher pH, and maybe even higher sugars. Can work for not completely dry bottle fermented sparkling wines, and they work great in tank fermented sparkling wines that don't age for a long time because they've got more flavor and aroma. But they're also chemically not so good for keeping around for a decade. You want to use them quick.
You talked quite a bit about wanting to get the skin off of the process early.
Yeah.
Is that the primary reason that houses that make rosé are adding a red wine when they disgorge?
No, I mean there's 2 different ways to make rosé sparkling wines. There's a Sanguet method where you crush, destem, and soak it and press it.
Not many people are doing that right now, I don't think. Right?
There's big arguments about what's the right way to do it. And that's true in Champagne and everywhere else that I know. That's a style question. But having said that, even when you do the Sanguet method, I don't think anybody uses. Now I'm going to get in dangerous territory here by making speculations. I speculate that the Sanguet guys don't do that for the entire blend. I could be really wrong, but I think there's a lot of blending is incredibly important and not much talked about other than to say blend. But there's all kinds of secretive things that are done in Champagne, not all of which are legal in Champagne, but are routinely done in Champagne. You had a question back.
Yeah, I know you kind of touched on it. Is there anything beyond just rotating what block you're allocating specifically for sparkling to ensure that you're not completely overcropping and setting these vines up to fail?
No, you can crop. You can grow the same blocks for sparkling year after year after year. That's not the question of if you've overcropped and really done bad things. You're going to have to let the vines, assuming they survive the winter, you're going to have to let them recover, and you're going to want to treat them gently the next year. But that's if you've made a mistake. There's no reason that you can't. I'm trying to think. The oldest block that we have done only for sparkling wine was planted in '86. So how old is that? 34 years. And that's been harvested every year just for sparkling wine. And it's fine. We have another one older that would have been fine if it wasn't for the hailstorm in 2015. The block that I really liked got wiped out in 2015 with the storm that knocked down all the trees in Glen Arbor. That hailstorm was really bad, and those vines are slowly recovering. Megan talks to them every day, and they understand how much she and I love them. But they're old, and they got hurt pretty badly. Yeah.
Can you address the question of pruning? You said it's prudent to make a decision a year in advance because it impacts your pruning for the sparkling wines.
Well, it's pruning is your first set of crop load, and so if you're if you're growing under our conditions, if you're growing either Chardonnay or Pinot Noir for table wine, you're probably going to want, well, Pinot Noir, you're probably going to want to have under 2 tons to the acre crop load. Whereas for sparkling, if you could get it to crop at 4 or 4.5, that'd be great. So that's a matter of how many buds are you going to leave, and to a lesser extent, I don't think that the question of cordon and spur pruning or cane pruning is related as much to the wine that you're making as the vineyard itself, the vines and the soil and its vigor. You're not going to make that kind of a change, I don't think. I used to think that it would be really nice in establishing a vineyard to grow the first couple 3 years of its harvest, to grow that for sparkling, with the idea that you were not going to try to maximize the yield, but you were going to try to harvest early and give those vines more time with functioning leaves at the end of the year to help them develop a better root system. That's really good for the vines. It's not going to make the best sparkling wine to do that, but it's a long-term investment in the vineyard to do that, and I think that still makes some sense. With sparkling wine, you don't want the berry broken until it's in the press and starting to be pressed. That's at that point that you want the berries broken. So anything that will cause berries to break between the time you clip them off the vine and the time they get in the press is bad. Usually that means you want to try to pick in small containers. If you're going to deliver it to the winery in the typical bins, don't fill them too full. Don't let your tractor drivers be cowboys. Don't go fast. Get it gently on the truck. Get the truck down the road to the wine. It's just be careful. Be careful, because
Dump them nicely.
and then when you're loading the press, you treat it with care and respect. I mean, you've worked at least a year to grow these things, and the winemaker wants to make the best wine they possibly can from it, so they want that to be delivered as pristinely as possible.